Hey everybody, it's Lindsay and welcome to another episode of Leminary where I talk about what I have been learning in seminary school. And today we're going to talk about church planting, which is my favorite subject because that is what my degree is specialized in. But I thought instead of giving you guys a bunch of theology today that I would read you a story. And this story comes from a book that I had to read just this week for my church planting class, Global Church Planting. It's about 400 pages of strategy and theology behind church planting, and I am not going to read that to you. I'm going to read you guys a story about some apple trees. The Parable of the Apple Trees. Once upon a time, there was a land where many people were starving. It was a terrible time of suffering, and no one seemed to know what to do. The apple trees of the town were moved with compassion, especially as they saw the many hungry children. They decided that they could be a part of the solution. Each tree would try to increase its harvest to provide more food. One particular tree had an especially great vision to become the largest and most productive tree that could feed hundreds of people. He determined to extend his branches wide and sink his roots deep. And he did. He grew greater and stronger, with broad and graceful branches. His trunk was stately as a Corinthian column, his roots muscular. He became very productive, the envy of all the other apple trees, doubling, even tripling the number of apples that he could grow, feeding more and more people. And the apples that he bore were the tastiest and largest apples to be found. He was also very concerned that no fruit go to waste. So he developed a way to hold on to his fruit until the harvesters arrived, not letting a single apple drop to the ground. It was a brilliant plan. Many children were nourished and survived the winter thanks to him. But Megatree gradually became frustrated. His branches grew so wide and heavy that each year, when the fall winds would blow, large branches would crack. Some would even come crashing down, wasting precious fruit and slowing production. These would have to be regrown if the same number of apples were to be harvested next year. One year the winds were so strong and Megatree had grown so large that he was nearly uprooted altogether. That gave him a pretty big scare. But what disturbed Megatree most was his realization that he had reached his productive capacity. No matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't increase production anymore. And worst of all, he realized that there were many hungry people he still could not feed. Meanwhile, there was another apple tree in town. This tree was also moved with compassion and wanted to feed as many hungry people as possible. But he was rather small and unseemly. His fruit was not very sweet, and sometimes it was even a bit wormy. And he didn't produce a tenth of the harvest that the Megatree produced. He was embarrassed by the fact that his fruit often fell to the ground and rotted before it could be harvested. So of the little fruit that he did bear, less still went to feed the hungry. Apple growers, of course, took no notice of him and would walk right past him on the way to visit Megatree. So unbeautiful was this tree that he received the nickname Twiggy. Twiggy began to feel sorry for himself. "You're a poor excuse for a tree," he would be woefully say to himself over and over, shaking his boughs sadly. "You'll never be able to feed many of the hungry." Looking over at the elegant and expansive branches of Megatree, he'd see the many crates of large, beautiful apples being harvested, and that made him feel even more like a failure. It also made him a bit jealous, which he didn't like to admit to himself. Sometimes he'd make excuses for himself. "It's the soil. If I had the soil that Megatree has, I could do what he does. But he knew in his heart it wasn't really true. One day, as Twiggy's eyes were cast toward the ground in a sulk, he noticed something quite odd. There, not far from his roots, grew a little plant. Upon closer inspection, it proved in fact to be a little baby apple tree. At first he thought, oh no, that's just what I need now. Someone with whom I have to share this lousy, unfertile soil. I'll probably bear even less fruit once he grows up. His roots will probably get tangled with mine. He might even block my sunlight. Twiggy's resentment grew toward both Megatree and Babytree until suddenly he was struck by a thought, as if struck by lightning, and for a tree, that's a pretty shocking experience. He realized that Babytree was a result of one of Twiggy's apples falling to the ground. And if that thought wasn't earth-shaking enough, another followed quickly. If I just keep letting some of my apples fall so that their seeds grow into trees, there could be lots of new apple trees bearing fruit and feeding many more people. Though Twiggy was not very good at math, he knew enough to reason. In fact, the sum of all those apples on the trees growing from my seeds will be more, yes, much more, than even Megatree is producing. We could feed many more people. But wait, Twiggy mused further. What if my baby trees also let some of their apples fall to the ground? Then they would grow into even more new trees, bearing even more fruit and feeding even more people. And then those trees could also drop some fruit. And then, by golly, we could feed the whole world at that rate. And so it was that Twiggy gladly began letting some of his apples fall to the ground. Some passersby sneered, "How wasteful! You'll never amount to anything." Or they jeered, "Why don't you take a lesson from Megatree?" But Twiggy just kept on quietly, faithfully letting some apples fall, and as he had hoped, some of his offspring followed his example. Soon enough, there were apple trees growing throughout the whole land, and though none of the trees ever were as impressive as Megatree, no children or grown-ups ever needed to go hungry in that town. The moral of the story: if you want to feed more people, don't merely grow more apples, bigger apples, and sweeter apples. Rather, plant more apple trees that in turn can reproduce yet more apple trees to grow exponentially more fruit. And if we want to feed a spiritually hungry world, we must seek to not merely grow bigger and better churches that reach more people, though that is certainly a good thing to do, but to plant churches that in turn reproduce more churches that reach exponentially more people. So, we learn from the story of the apple trees that it's not necessary to have the best skills to be able to speak publicly better than anyone else, to be an extrovert that attracts all sorts of people. Rather, it's better to be like Twiggy, to be willing to invest in just a small amount of people who then are also willing to invest in others. And this way, we will grow more and more disciples. So this not only applies to church planting, but it just applies to evangelism in general. So think of yourself as Twiggy, and we need more Twiggies. We need you to let your fruit fall to the ground so that more trees can grow. That seed of the gospel can be planted in the soil and grown, and we can have more and more people being spiritually fed and reached with the good news of the gospel. A lot of the church planting theory that is coming out now is it's just that. It's lay-led. It's people who are not necessarily trained theologically, people who maybe didn't go to seminary, people who are bivocational, people who are so passionate about the gospel that they work on planting churches and growing disciples on the weekends and in their free time. And that can be all of us. We can all work on growing disciples with the social networks that we're already a part of. So that's just some of what I'm learning in my church planting classes, that you don't necessarily have to go with a building and start a new big church and attract hundreds of people, but you just need to grow where you're planted and be willing to grow others along the way.